Somehow the nation survived 2.5 weeks without Kevin McCarthy, 2.5 weeks without having a House Speaker. And as was obvious would happen, House Republicans today banded together and elected a new Speaker. Here you see from the New York Times today, the headline, House elects Mike Johnson as Speaker, embracing a hard-right conservative. There you see the graphic. He is, of course, a hard-right conservative. Now, just to state the obvious, I don't think there's a single member of Congress, either in the House or the Senate, whom the United States would not call a far right or hard right. That's even worse. Hard right. No flexibility. This guy is a hard right. A hard right conservative. There's nobody to whom they would not apply that label except maybe Mitt Romney and like Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, and that's about it. Everybody else is hard right. Anybody who got elected to this speakership would be called that by the New York Times because they're obviously trying to spread the image that the Republican Party is irrevocably an extremist party because they want the Democrats to win. That goes without saying. Usually what they mean by hard right, though, is somebody who refuses to play ball with the establishment. So just like the fact that Mike Johnson is very unknown to most Americans, he's not unknown to viewers of our show since we've talked about him and interviewed him just very recently, but he is unknown to people. Just like that is a feather in his cap, a point in his favor, so too is the fact that the New York Times is already calling him hard right. So here's what they say in their news article trying to get the nation to think about Mike Johnson. Republicans turned to a little-known Louisiana lawmaker who led congressional efforts to overturn the 2020 election, ending a weeks-long deadlock that paralyzed the House. Here's a totally separate article. They have two articles, the New York Times does, on Mike Johnson elevation to the speakership. This one, the headline is, "The Far Right Gets Its Man of the House." So he's hard right and far right. Quote, "The new speaker, Mike Johnson, is virtually unknown to most Americans, but he can be expected to press a hard right social and fiscal agenda." So they worked in hard right there as well. Here's one of the other news articles. House elects Mike Johnson as Speaker, ending 3 weeks of chaos and paralysis. Quote, "After a tumultuous struggle that put their divisions on display," and by the way, it is true that Republicans have internal divisions in the party. There's ideological divisions and philosophical divisions. You have a significant portion of the House Republican caucus which supports Joe Biden's policy in funding war in Ukraine endlessly, and then you have a significant part of the House Republican caucus that opposes that. That's a vibrant internal debate within the Republican Party, the kind that the Democrats simply don't have any of. On the war in Ukraine, for example, essentially every single Democrat, not essentially, every single Democrat unanimously wants more funding for the war in Ukraine. Joe Biden just submitted a $105 billion new spending package to the Congress, $60 billion of which is for the war in Ukraine, on top of the $115 billion we've already spent on this war. Another $10 billion is for Israel, on top of the $4 billion that we give them each year as part of a deal that President Obama signed with President Netanyahu on the way out in 2016. There's another $10 billion for humanitarian aid divided between Ukraine, Israel, and Gaza. And then there's a little left over, basically pocket change, a few billion for border security. So $105 billion emergency spending package, almost none of which is going to programs for Americans or the American citizenry. It's all going to support foreign wars. So there are divisions within the Republican Party. Quote, "After a tumultuous struggle that put their divisions on display, Republicans turned to a little-known social conservative from Louisiana who led congressional efforts to overturn the 2020 election. Representative Mike Johnson of Louisiana won election on Wednesday as the 56th Speaker of the House, putting an end to 3 weeks of chaos that left the chamber without a leader and put Republican divisions on display. Republicans elevated Mr. Johnson, a little-known and deeply conservative lawmaker, deeply conservative, after a tumultuous fight. It began after the hard right ousted Kevin McCarthy." Do you think before this happened, the New York Times would have in any way implied that Kevin McCarthy was some sort of moderate? But now that he's gone, just like the way once George Bush was, when George Bush was in power, he was the new Hitler. And now George Bush is gone, so now George Bush is a fantastic man, somebody who maybe we didn't agree with, but loved democracy, was a decent human being. When Mitt Romney ran for president, they endlessly depicted him as a misogynist, somebody who kept a binder of women. Remember that phrase that he used? It was a little bit awkward of a phrase, and they used it for weeks to suggest that it was something creepy about him. And now they worship Mitt Romney. Once Republicans are no longer in power, the New York Times starts rehabilitating them and contrasting them with the people who are. Whoever is the last Republican is always the hard right. So now here you have the hard right ousting Kevin McCarthy, and raged on as the divided House Republicans nominated and then quickly discarded 3 other candidates to succeed him. The elevation of Mr. Johnson, 51, an architect of the effort to overturn the 2020 election and a religious conservative opposed to abortion rights, homosexuality, and gay marriage, further cemented the Republican Party's lurch to the right. It came after a historic fight that began when the hard right, can you believe, these are like liberal ad libs to scare liberal America. It came after a historic fight that began when the hard right ousted Speaker Kevin McCarthy on October 3rd, and raged on as the divided House GOP nominated and quickly discarded 3 other candidates to succeed him, exhausted from the feuding, which unleashed a barrage of recriminations and violent threats against lawmakers, both the right-wing and mainstream Republicans, finally united to elect Mr. Johnson, 51, in a 220 to 209 vote. Worn down by a brutal stretch of infighting, they finally decided to elect him, it says. Now, the interesting dynamic here is that Mike Johnson is somebody who isn't very well known, but he is somebody who has developed a clear record on a variety of important issues. So right now, the 2 most significant issues facing the Congress, not necessarily because they are the 2 most important issues facing the United States, but it's the ones that Congress has decided are their priorities, that the White House has made their priorities, are the war in Ukraine and then the war that Israel has with Gaza. 2 wars that have almost nothing to do with American citizens, but these are the 2 issues dominating the congressional agenda in Congress. And here from the Hill today, they try and summarize what Mike Johnson's positions are on both Ukraine and Israel. Quote, Johnson made a strong statement in support of Ukraine in its effort to fight back against Russia in the wake of the invasion in February 2022. He said, quote, we should impose debilitating sanctions on Russia's economic interest. He posted to Twitter, quote, we should return to robust American energy production to provide greater stability and security here and for our European allies. We should exclude Russia from global commerce and international institutions. Even though the best time to take these actions is past, we must act decisively. And then in April 2022, he voted for the Ukrainian Democracy Defense Lend-Lease Act of 2022, a bill that aimed to ease the process for the U.S. to send military aid to Ukraine, which was later signed by President Biden. However, in recent times, he has taken a skeptical stance toward aid for Ukraine. He voted against 2 different appropriations bills that provided aid to Ukraine, one in 2022 and another last month. Quote, American taxpayers have sent over $100 billion in aid to Ukraine in the last year, Johnson said in a Twitter post in February. Quote, they deserve to know if the Ukrainian government is being entirely forthcoming and transparent about the use of the massive sum of taxpayer resources. Now, when we had him on our show, I asked him about Ukraine, and he kind of paid some lip service to the fact that it's important that Russia not win, but he was also starting to get skeptical of how much money we were sending there, which already is something that the establishment hates. The establishment's top priority right now are Israel and Ukraine in equal measure. That's why President Biden is trying to tie the 2 together. He knows that the public has turned against funding for Ukraine, that there are not the votes in Congress for billions and billions more in Ukraine, and their only hope is to tie Israel spending to Ukraine spending so that Republicans can't possibly vote no on Israel spending. Otherwise, the White House will accuse them of abandoning Israel. But right now, the Speaker of the House is somebody who has clearly staked his position that he thinks there's too much money flowing to Ukraine. I don't know if his view is there should be no more, if it should slow down. That remains to be seen. But he clearly is, like the people who helped remove Kevin McCarthy, somebody who's become increasingly skeptical about the U.S. war in Ukraine, as he should. We have spent tens of billions of dollars. The front line has barely moved. If anything, right now, with the winter coming, hopes for a Ukrainian counteroffensive are gone. The Russians, in fact, are the ones often launching offensives. So we'll see what happens there. But when we interviewed Mike Johnson in July, it was the day that Christopher Wray, the FBI director, appeared before the Congress, and one of the main focuses of that hearing were the Twitter files, the evidence that Matt Taibbi and other journalists who were given access to Twitter's files by Elon Musk had unearthed, showing that the FBI was badgering and pressuring and coercing Twitter and other social media platforms to remove political speech the FBI disliked. And remember, in the court ruling, which first a district court judge issued and then an appellate court upheld, that found that the Biden administration had launched one of the most egregious and gravest breaches on the First Amendment's guarantee of free speech by pressuring big tech to censor. The FBI was part of that. The appellate court concluded the FBI was one of the agencies under Christopher Wray that had violated the First Amendment. I just want to pause and remember how serious that is. That 4 federal judges now, 1 at the district court level, 3 at the appellate court level, have ruled that the FBI violated the free speech rights of Americans in a systematic and pervasive way by trying to censor the internet to adhere to government policy. The U.S. Supreme Court this week agreed to take up the case. They stayed the injunction that had been issued banning the FBI and the Biden White House from continuing to communicate with big tech platforms, but they agreed to take the case. We'll see where that goes. But that was the context in which we had Mike Johnson on, and we reported on the House hearing, and specifically the role that he played in grilling Christopher Wray over these issues and others. So let me show you a little bit of that hearing. This is from July 26th of this year.
Secretary Mayorkas, we have the frustrating responsibility on this committee.
Sorry, so let me just actually go back and correct myself that at this hearing, this particular hearing, he was questioning the Homeland Security Secretary, Senator Mayorkas, about various issues regarding the U.S. security state's involvement in the free speech rights, but also in various other issues as well. Listen to what he did.
We have the frustrating responsibility on this committee of providing oversight of your agency, but I have to be honest and tell you, I'm not sure exactly what you do at the Department of Homeland Security other than great harm. On your watch, the data is pretty clear. We've had record levels of illegal immigration, a rapid decline in deportations, skyrocketing fentanyl deaths across our country, and the Secret Service, which is a DHS component, can't determine who left cocaine at the White House. In the middle of all this, you created this Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency, CISA, which is a division of DHS. And it's one of the Biden administration agencies that colluded with and coerced the social media companies to censor Americans' protected free speech online. That's specifically detailed in a 155-page court opinion that came out of the federal court in Louisiana in the landmark litigation of Missouri v. Biden. Have you read that court opinion?
Okay, so let me just set the context here because there are 2 different hearings that we talked about Mike Johnson with regard to. So let me just back up for a second. This was when the Homeland Security Secretary was appearing before the committee. It was days after the federal court had issued this scathing ruling, really a historic ruling in the history of the First Amendment, where they said that several executive branch agencies, including Homeland Security and the FBI, had gravely violated the First Amendment free speech right. The appellate court ended up saying that it was one of the gravest assaults on free speech in the history of the judiciary. And so when the head of one of those agencies, Secretary Mayorkas, went before the committee, and when we had Congressman Johnson on our show, he was saying he thought this court ruling should be headline news everywhere, which is what we had already said, that the consequences of this court ruling were so immense, and yet it barely got any coverage. Because, for obvious reasons, it was incriminating the Biden administration, but also it condemned a censorship regime which the corporate media had spent years cheering and championing and helping to build. So, of course, they weren't going to report much on this finding that they had all colluded to violate the Constitution, that the corporate media in the United States that calls themselves journalists were championing a First Amendment violation. So, Congressman Johnson was one of the few people when Mayorkas went before the committee to say, you're head of an agency that just got caught violating the First Amendment. What do you have to say about yourself? And the more he evaded, the more relentless he became. Watch.
DHS, and it's one of the Biden administration agencies that colluded with and coerced the social media companies to censor Americans' protected free speech online. That's specifically detailed in a 155-page court opinion that came out of the federal court in Louisiana in the landmark litigation of Missouri v. Biden. Have you read that court opinion?
Congressman, I have not, and the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency does not censor speech.
Okay, well, the court found otherwise, and it's really curious to me. Actually, it's quite alarming that you haven't read the opinion, because your agency is listed in this opinion. The federal court looked at volumes of evidence over months of litigation, and they determined, among other things, that if the allegations made by the plaintiffs, the states in this case, are true, and hold on, the preliminary injunction was granted against your agency, sir, and other Biden administration agencies, including the DOJ and FBI, the court said it involves the most massive attack against free speech in United States history. And you're telling me this opinion issued July 4th has not reached your desk? No one's briefed you on it?
Oh, I have been briefed on the Missouri litigation.
Okay, but you haven't taken the time to read it yet.
Congressman,
No, hold on. Have you read it or not?
I have read parts of it,
Oh,
Congressman.
parts of it. Did you read the parts where it said that this is Orwellian and dystopian and that your agency is involved in a massive cover-up of specifically conservatives' free speech online?
Congressman, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency is not involved in such conduct.
Okay, well, the court found otherwise, and you stand here under oath and you give us these answers that we know are not true because this is demonstrably untrue. I'm suggesting to you that you're saying things to us under oath that are proven by the record to be untrue. Let me ask you about this specifically.
Now, one of the things I have to say is that a lot of times in these congressional hearings, a lot of members of Congress in both parties use them to hog the camera, to make spectacles of themselves, very desperately trying to produce viral moments. And so often they're just vapid, performative theater designed to feed the base and try and get attention from themselves that has no real substance. And what this is the opposite. He's being very self-spoken, very precise in his language. It's based on an obvious familiarity with the court ruling, which you would expect from a trained constitutional lawyer who worked in constitutional law in defense of people's religious freedom and litigating the Constitution. He understands it at an expert level, and it shows. And the questions are very respectful, but they're also very adversarial. They're demanding an answer and pointing out when he's lying, and demonstrably so. And that's what I found impressive about it, that he's a serious person who's clearly smart and came very prepared to this hearing because this is an issue of utmost importance to him, as it should be. And he was one of the very few people in Congress to truly comprehend the magnitude and gravity of this ruling. Let's watch the rest.
CISA was created to, we call it the Misinformation and Disinformation Subcommittee of CISA. Are you familiar with that?
Congressman,
the MDM subcommittee, you familiar with that?
Congressman, I am very well aware of the threat of disinformation emanating from adverse nations.
Are you familiar with the subcommittee? Just answer the question.
I am.
Okay. Does it still exist?
Congressman, are you speaking of the...
Does the MDM subcommittee still exist?
I would have to get back to you on that.
Okay. All right. Kind of a big deal in your agency. I'm kind of shocked that you don't know the answer to that. Can you define what misinformation is?
Congressman, misinformation is false information that is disseminated to...
Excellent. Who determines what is false?
Congressman, our focus...
No, who determines what is false in your agency?
Congressman,
If you're going to pull something off the internet and collude with a social media platform to make sure Americans don't see it, who determines what's false?
If I were on this committee and I had one question to ask, this is the question I would ask over and over. You keep saying that the role of the federal government now somehow is to make sure Americans are safe from disinformation. You want to censor the internet to remove things that are described as disinformation. First, he asked, what is your definition of disinformation? He said things that are false. And then this is the question at the heart of all of this. Who determines falsity? Who determines truth and falsehood? And the fact that that's where he was leading the whole time, this is the heart of the matter, the crux of this entire attempt by the federal government to seize control of the exact thing that the First Amendment was designed to protect from ever being interfered with by the federal government. which is political speech. And this is what happened when he tried to get to the answer.
Congressman, we don't do that.
That's not true. That is not true. That is not what the court has found. This is not a Republican talking point. This is what the documents show. We've had people testify under oath that say, and you just defined the term, you're telling me that you don't know who determines what is false?
Congressman, what we do at CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, is identify the tactics that adverse nation states use to weaponize disinformation.
Okay, what is disinformation? What is disinformation?
Disinformation is inaccurate information.
Who determines what's inaccurate? Who determines what's false? Do you understand the problem here? The reason the framers of our Constitution did not create an exception for quote unquote false information from the First Amendment is because they didn't trust the government to determine what it is. And you have whole committees of people in your agency trying to determine what they define as false or misinformation.
That is not true.
Well, then what is true?
What we
Please
do
enlighten us.
is what we do is we disclose the tactics that adverse nation states are utilizing to weaponize information.
No, sir. The court found specifically it's a finding of fact that is not disputed by the government defendants, the Biden administration, your agency, the FBI, or DHS, not in the litigation. They determined you and all of your cohorts made no distinction between domestic speech and foreign speech. So don't stand there and tell me under oath that you only focused on adversaries around the world, foreign actors. That's not true.
Congressman, the Missouri case, the litigation to which you refer, is the subject of continuing litigation.
But the facts were not disputed, and I so regret that I'm out of time. I hope I get some more yielded. I yield back.
Okay, that was 3 months ago. That was July 26th. And if you had told me 3 months ago, on July 26th, that person right there in that video of 5 minutes, who did such an expert job of constructing those questions, who came incredibly prepared, but more so was obviously so passionate. I mean, if you listen to that and you're not enraged, then I don't understand what you think America is supposed to be about. The reason he was enraged, and the rage was very controlled, it was very focused, it was very substantive, was because Mayorkas was saying over and over, we are here to protect the country from disinformation, and then he refused to say who defines what disinformation is, because of course the answer is we do, we the government are defining what is true and false, which is as grave a violation of the First Amendment as you can get. And maybe it's just being a constitutional lawyer and that's just so reflexive and instinctive. But if you had told me 3 months ago that that person was going to be Speaker of the House in 3 months, the person who just did that, I would have said, please tell me the directions of the parallel universe in which you're residing so I can move there. Because whatever else is true about this person who we're going to now show you, and we're going to have disagreements with him, obviously, the fact that he's able to do that, and not just able to do that, but felt that, believes that, is obviously a gigantic advancement over Kevin McCarthy, which granted is a low bar, but it is clearly an advancement with nothing else to be seen. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.